deep space monitoring station Epsilon 7 sat quietly in the empty void between star systems, its massive antenna arrays slowly rotating as they scanned the cosmic background for any signs of intelligent life. The station had been humanity's listening post for over a decade, and most days brought nothing but the usual cosmic static and routine transmissions from nearby colonies. Hume-Wu had been working the night shift for 3 years now, and he knew the sounds of space like a musician knows their instrument. The 26-year-old communications specialist could tell the difference between solar interference, pulsar emissions, and the digital chatter of human cargo ships just by listening to the audio feed. Tonight felt different though, as he sipped his lukewarm coffee and watched the data streams scroll across his monitor. Something made him pause. There it was again, a faint signal that seemed to dance just below the threshold of normal detection. Most people would have missed it entirely, but Hyan-Wu had spent countless hours fine-tuning the station's receivers. His fingers moved quickly across the control panel, isolating the frequency and boosting the signal strength. The pattern was unlike anything in their databases. "Hey Minho, come take a look at this." Hyan-Wu called out to his supervisor, who was making his rounds through the monitoring bay. The older man had seen it all during his 15 years at Epsilon 7, and his usual response to unusual readings was skeptical indifference. Minho walked over with heavy steps, already preparing his standard response. "Let me guess, another ghost signal from some malfunctioning mining equipment." He leaned over Hyan-Wu's shoulder and glanced at the display without much interest. The automated classification system had already marked the transmission as low priority. Background noise. Probably just civilian chatter from one of the Outer Rim colonies. But Hyan-Wu wasn't satisfied with the computer's assessment. He had learned to trust his instincts over the years, and something about this signal felt intentional. The frequency pattern had a mathematical precision that random noise simply didn't possess. He adjusted the filters one more time and played back a longer sample. "This isn't random interference," Hyan-Wu insisted, pointing at the waveform display. "Look at these intervals. They're too regular, too structured. And listen to the harmonic resonance." He played the audio through the speakers, and both men fell silent as an almost musical quality emerged from what had initially sounded like static. Minho's expression shifted from annoyance to curiosity. In all his years monitoring deep space communications, he had never heard anything quite like this. The signal seemed to pulse with an alien rhythm, as if someone or something was trying to communicate using patterns that human technology barely recognized as artificial. The two men spent the next hour analyzing the transmission, running it through every decryption protocol and linguistic analysis program they had available. Nothing worked. Whatever was sending this signal was using a completely unknown method of communication, and it was coming from a region of space that human explorers had never visited. As dawn approached on their artificial day cycle, Hyan-Wu made a decision that would change everything. Instead of filing the signal away as unexplained phenomena, he marked it for immediate review by the Xenolinguistics department back on Earth. Dr. Yunji had barely slept in 3 days. Empty coffee cups littered her desk at Terra's Xenolinguistics laboratory, and her usually neat hair was pulled back in a messy bun. The mysterious signal from Epsilon 7 had consumed every waking moment since it arrived on her desk. As the head of humanity's premier alien language research department, she had seen plenty of false alarms over the years, but something about this transmission felt genuinely different. The signal had initially appeared to be nothing more than cosmic background radiation, with some unusual patterns. However, Youngji's trained eye had spotted mathematical relationships hidden within the seemingly random noise. She had spent countless hours feeding the data through every linguistic analysis program in their extensive database, searching for any hint of structure or meaning. On the third night, breakthrough came in the most unexpected way. Yanji had been running the signal through a program designed to detect emotional patterns in speech, when suddenly, fragments began to make sense. The alien communication wasn't just conveying information, it was saturated with desperation and fear. Dongyi, she called out excitedly to her research partner, who was working late in the adjacent lab. Her voice echoed through the empty corridors of the research facility. Drop everything and get in here right now. Donghyun rushed into her lab, nearly spilling his own coffee in the process. He had been working on routine translation protocols for the Mars colonies, but the urgency in Yoonji's voice told him this was something much more important. The two scientists had been partners for over 8 years, and he had learned to recognize when she was onto something significant. I've cracked the basic syntax, Yoonji explained rapidly, her fingers dancing across the holographic display. Look at these frequency modulations here. They're not random at all. They're grammatical markers, similar to how we use tone changes in human languages to convey meaning. The decoded fragments appeared on the main screen, translated into rough English approximations. References to a species calling themselves the Kethfel became clear, along with repeated mentions of something they called the Burning Fleet. The more text they decoded, the more disturbing the message became. Donghyun leaned closer to read the translations, his expression growing increasingly grim. This isn't a greeting or a peaceful first contact message, he realized. They're describing some kind of attack or invasion. The alien words painted a picture of systematic destruction and unimaginable cruelty. The Kethfo were describing their cities being burned, their people being taken, and their entire civilization being methodically dismantled by these mysterious attackers. What made it even more chilling was the clinical precision with which the aliens described their own suffering. As more of the signal became readable, both scientists realized they were looking at something unprecedented in human history, not just first contact with an alien species, but a desperate plea for help from a civilization facing complete annihilation. The transmission wasn't random cosmic noise at all. It was a final cry for help, broadcast into the void in the desperate hope that someone, somewhere, might hear it and respond. The implications were staggering, and both researchers knew that their discovery would change everything humanity thought it knew about its place in the universe. The complete translation took another week to finish, and by the end of it, Dr. Yoonji wished she had never started the project. What began as an exciting scientific breakthrough had transformed into something that would haunt her for the rest of her life. The Kethvel message wasn't just a call for help, it was a detailed record of horrors that no civilized mind should ever have to comprehend. Senior analyst Jinwoo had joined the translation team to help process the massive amount of data. A veteran linguist who had worked on dozens of challenging projects, he prided himself on maintaining professional objectivity no matter how disturbing the content. But this alien transmission broke through every defense mechanism he had built over his 20-year career. The first time Jinwoo had to leave the room was when they decoded the sections describing what the Kethvel called processing centers. These weren't military installations or prison camps in any conventional sense. They were vast industrial complexes designed with one purpose: to inflict maximum suffering on as many beings as possible, while keeping them alive for extended periods. I need some air, Jinwoo had muttered, pushing back from his workstation, with shaking hands. Yoonji understood completely. She had felt the same wave of nausea when the translation algorithms first revealed the true scope of what was happening to the Kethfel civilization. The aliens described their captors with a mixture of terror and confusion. The burning fleet didn't seem motivated by resources, territory, or any logical military objective. Instead, they appeared to derive some twisted satisfaction from the systematic destruction of entire populations. The Kethfel had tried to understand their attackers' motivations, but had concluded that cruelty itself was the primary goal. What made the message even more disturbing was its clinical precision. The Kethfel had documented everything with scientific accuracy, creating a detailed record of their own destruction. They described massive facilities where millions of their people were held in conditions designed to maximize psychological and physical torment. The aliens spoke of their captors studying different methods of inflicting pain, as if the entire invasion was some kind of horrific experiment. Jinwoo returned to the lab after his second break, looking pale and determined. "We have to finish this," he told Yunji quietly. "No matter how terrible it gets, someone needs to know what happened to them." The final sections of the transmission revealed the most heartbreaking truth of all. The message wasn't being sent by Kethville military forces or government officials. It was being broadcast by the last free scientists on their homeworld, using the final moments before their capture to send one desperate plea into the darkness of space. They had included detailed star charts showing the path of destruction left by the burning fleet, along with technical specifications of the attackers' ships and weapons. The Kethval had spent their final hours not trying to save themselves, but ensuring that if anyone ever received their message, they would have the information needed to recognize and fight these monsters. The transmission ended abruptly, cutting off mid-sentence as the last Kethval research station went dark. 14 months had passed since that final broadcast, and the silence from their region of space was absolute. An entire civilization had been erased from existence, leaving only their desperate warning echoing through the void. The emergency briefing at Terra Command had been called at 0600 hours, and the most powerful military leaders in human space sat around the polished conference table in complete silence. Admiral Soyoung had seen her share of horrors during her 30-year career. She had commanded rescue operations after the Titan colony disaster, led peacekeeping forces during the Mars Rebellion, and overseen humanitarian missions to 3 different war zones. But nothing in her experience had prepared her for what she was watching on the holographic display. The translated Kethville recordings played out in stark detail, showing the systematic destruction of an entire civilization. Every few minutes, Soyoung noticed another hardened military officer look away from the screen or take a deep breath to steady themselves. These were people who had dedicated their lives to protecting humanity, and they were witnessing something that challenged every assumption they had about warfare and civilized behavior. General Taman sat at the far end of the table, his weathered hands clasped so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. The veteran ground forces commander had fought in brutal campaigns across 3 star systems, but his jaw muscles kept clenching involuntarily as he watched the alien footage. He had seen cities burned and populations displaced, but never anything approaching this level of calculated cruelty. "How long since this transmission was sent?" Defense Minister Ji Hai asked quietly, breaking the heavy silence that had settled over the room. Her voice was carefully controlled, but everyone present could hear the underlying tension. As the civilian head of Earth's military forces, she had to consider not just the emotional impact of this discovery, but its strategic implications for all of humanity. Intelligence Chief Wu Jin consulted his tablet before responding. "Our analysis indicates the signal was transmitted 14 months ago. Based on the star charts the Kethville provided, and our understanding of faster-than-light travel patterns, the burning fleet could be anywhere within a roughly 50 light radius of their original position." The mathematical precision of his answer somehow made the situation even more chilling. 14 months was enough time for these monsters to have destroyed several more civilizations, leaving the same trail of systematic torture and death across multiple star systems, somewhere out there in the darkness of space. The burning fleet was continuing their work, completely unaware that their actions had been recorded and transmitted across the galaxy. "The burning fleet is still out there," Wu Jin continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "Still active, still moving from system to system." The briefing room fell silent again, but this time the quiet had a different quality. It wasn't the stunned silence of people trying to process incomprehensible information. This was the cold, focused silence of apex predators, recognizing a threat that needed to be eliminated. Every person present understood what this meant for humanity. For the first time in their species' history, they had encountered something truly evil, not misguided, not desperate, not fighting for resources or survival, but genuinely malevolent. The burning fleet represented everything that civilized beings feared. Most about the darkness between the stars, and every person in that room understood exactly what humanity's response would be. The sleeping giant was about to wake up, and the galaxy would never be the same. The transformation began before most people even realized what was happening. Within hours of the emergency briefing, priority messages flashed across military networks throughout human space. Reserve Admiral Kung Su was enjoying his retirement on Luna when his personal communicator buzzed with an emergency recall code he hadn't seen in 15 years. The old warrior didn't hesitate. He was suited up and heading to the nearest transport within 20 minutes from his command shuttle. Kung Su watched in amazement as Luna's massive construction yards came alive with activity that hadn't been seen since the end of the colony wars. Enormous dreadnoughts that had been sitting in mothballs for decades were being towed out of storage hangars by teams of industrial tugs. These weren't the sleek patrol vessels that most galactic species associated with human military power. These were the true warships that humanity had built when they thought they might need to fight for their very survival. The sight sent chills down his spine. Each of these vessels represented the pinnacle of human military engineering from an era when humanity was still learning what it meant to be a spacefaring species. They had been designed not for peacekeeping or exploration, but for total warfare against unknown threats among the stars. Fleet Captain Hay-1 received her orders while conducting routine training exercises near Mars. The message was brief and coded, but its meaning was crystal clear. Operation Lazarus was now active. She had studied the classified protocols during her command training, but never expected to see them implemented. Lazarus was humanity's contingency plan for species-level threats, and it hadn't been updated since the theoretical alien invasion scenarios of the early colonization period. Within hours, Hay-1 was overseeing the reactivation of Titan-class vessels that most people assumed were museum pieces. These massive ships had been built during humanity's most paranoid period, when military planners assumed that any alien contact would be hostile. They incorporated weapon systems and defensive technologies that violated several peacetime treaties humanity had signed with other galactic civilizations, but the most dramatic changes were happening in the classified research facilities scattered throughout the solar system. Project Director Sung Ho had spent most of his career working on theoretical weapon systems that he hoped would never be needed. For 20 years, his team had developed increasingly sophisticated methods of warfare, storing their designs in sealed vaults with the understanding that they represented humanity's darkest potential. Now, those seals were being broken. Sung Ho worked around the clock with his research teams, converting 2 decades of theoretical work into practical weapons systems. The projects had names like Prometheus Protocol and Pandora Array weapons, designed to fight enemies that conventional military doctrine couldn't handle. Other galactic species began to notice the unusual activity almost immediately. Trade ships reported massive military convoys moving through previously quiet shipping lanes. Diplomatic observers noted the sudden recall of human ambassadors and the cancellation of cultural exchange programs. Most disturbing of all, deep space monitoring stations detected energy signatures from human space that didn't match any known civilian or standard military applications. The peaceful humans that the galaxy had grown comfortable with were revealing capabilities that most species hadn't known existed. Humanity's true military potential had been hidden behind decades of diplomatic cooperation and peaceful exploration. But the Kethval transmission had awakened something that had been sleeping since humanity first reached for the stars. Captain Bioram had commanded the UES Retribution through countless peacekeeping missions, but nothing had prepared her for what she saw through the bridge's main viewport. The planet below had once been home to billions of Kethvel, a thriving world with cities that sparkled like jewels across 3 continents. Now it was a barren wasteland, its surface scarred with geometric patterns that could only have been created by deliberate, systematic destruction. "Captain, we're detecting no life signs on the surface," reported her tactical officer, his voice carefully neutral, despite the horrific implications. "Atmospheric readings show traces of industrial pollutants consistent with large-scale processing operations." Bioram nodded grimly and turned to her chief science officer. Namjun had volunteered for this mission, knowing it would be the most difficult assignment of his career. As a xenobiologist, he had spent years studying alien life forms with wonder and curiosity. Now he was being asked to document the complete extinction of an entire species. "Deploy the investigation teams," Bioram ordered. "Full hazmat protocols. I want every structure, every facility, every piece of evidence documented and preserved." The first shuttles launched within the hour, carrying teams of Marines and scientists to the planet's surface. What they found there would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The burning fleet hadn't simply conquered the Kethvel homeworld. They had transformed it into something unrecognizable, Commander. Eugen led the ground reconnaissance team to what had once been the planet's largest city. Her Marines were tough, experienced soldiers who had seen combat across multiple star systems, but several of them requested reassignment after the first day of investigation. The city's buildings were still standing, but they had been converted into something that defied description. "Command, this is Ground Team Alpha," Eugen reported over the comm system, her voice tight with controlled emotion. "The entire metropolitan area has been ... modified. The structures appear to have been systematically converted for purposes of prolonged captivity and systematic harm. The investigation teams worked methodically through the dead world, documenting evidence that painted a picture of calculated cruelty that exceeded humanity's worst historical nightmares. The burning fleet had spent months on this world, taking their time to perfect their methods before moving on to their next target. Namchen's scientific reports grew increasingly clinical as the scope of the atrocities became clear. He found himself unable to process the emotional weight of what he was documenting, so he focused on the technical details, structural modifications, energy consumption patterns, logistical requirements. It was the only way he could continue working without breaking down completely. Word of the discoveries spread through the human fleet with devastating effect. Hardened military personnel, who had dedicated their lives to protecting innocent people, were confronted with evidence of suffering on a scale that challenged their fundamental understanding of evil. The rage that had been building since the first translation of the Kethvel message now had physical evidence to fuel it. Other galactic species, monitoring human communications, began to notice a change in tone that they had never heard before. Human diplomatic messages became shorter and more direct. Trade negotiations were postponed indefinitely. Cultural exchange programs were quietly canceled. The galaxy was beginning to understand that they had never truly known their human neighbors. For decades, humanity had presented itself as a peaceful, exploratory species interested in cooperation and mutual understanding. But the discovery of the Kethvel genocide had revealed something darker underneath that diplomatic facade, a capacity for focused, methodical violence that most species had never suspected existed. Overlord Vextar reclined in his command throne aboard the flagship Torment's Edge, reviewing the latest communications intercepts with barely concealed amusement. For over 3 centuries, his burning fleet had swept across this section of the galaxy, and the pattern was always the same. First came the desperate pleas for mercy, then the pathetic attempts at negotiation, and finally the inevitable surrender, followed by the delicious harvest of suffering. The intercepted human transmissions fit the familiar pattern perfectly. These new creatures were apparently called humans, and they seemed to be following the same predictable script that dozens of other species had used before them. Vexstar's translation systems had decoded their basic language structure within hours, revealing what appeared to be standard diplomatic overtures and offers of tribute. Another species of weaklings, seeking to bargain for their lives, Vexstar mused to his second-in-command. How refreshing. It has been months since we encountered proper resistance. These humans will provide adequate entertainment before we harvest their worlds. The Overlord had built his reputation on his ability to break the strongest civilizations through carefully applied terror. He had perfected techniques for crushing military resistance and civilian morale simultaneously, turning entire star systems into feeding grounds for his fleet's twisted appetites. No species had ever surprised him. They all followed the same predictable patterns of fear and desperation. That confidence lasted exactly until Admiral So-Young's battle group dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the Kepler 442 system. The human fleet appeared without warning, their ships emerging from faster-than-light travel in perfect formation. Vexstar's tactical officers immediately began their standard intimidation protocols, broadcasting threats and demands for surrender across all frequencies. They expected the usual terrified responses, the desperate attempts at communication, the inevitable capitulation. Instead, the humans opened fire immediately. The first salvo caught Vexstar's forces completely off guard. Human weapons systems that shouldn't have existed, according to galactic technology. Databases tore through burning fleet shields like they were made of paper. Energy beams that operated on principles Vexstar scientists couldn't identify punched through armor plating that had withstood centuries of warfare. Within 3 minutes, the heavy cruiser Suffering's glory was reduced to expanding debris. 2 minutes later, the destroyer Pain's Embrace suffered a catastrophic reactor breach and exploded in a brilliant flash of nuclear fire. The third vessel, Agony's Promise, lasted barely long enough to send a panicked distress signal before its entire command section was vaporized by a weapon that seemed to bend space itself. Impossible, Vexstar roared, his composure finally cracking as he watched centuries of military doctrine prove useless against these unknown attackers. No species fights like this. Where are their negotiations? Where are their demands for surrender? The surviving ships of his advanced squadron transmitted increasingly desperate reports. Human vessels moved with coordination that defied understanding, anticipating burning fleet tactics before they were even implemented. Their weapon systems operated with efficiency that suggested centuries of warfare experience. But galactic records indicated that humans were a relatively young spacefaring species. Most disturbing of all, the humans weren't trying to capture prisoners or salvage technology. They were systematically destroying every burning fleet vessel they encountered with a methodical precision that reminded Vexstar uncomfortably of his own techniques. For the first time in 3 centuries, the Overlord felt something he had almost forgotten: genuine fear. These humans weren't following any of the expected patterns. They weren't trying to negotiate or bargain for their survival. They were hunting. Fleet. Admiral Chongman stood in the command center of the UES Vengeance, watching as tactical displays showed the systematic dismantling of burning fleet positions across 7 star systems. What had started as humanity's first contact with truly malevolent aliens had evolved into something resembling a carefully orchestrated extermination campaign. The difference was that humans had centuries of experience in exactly this type of warfare. The galactic community had always known that Earth was classified as a death world, a planet so hostile that only the most adaptable and aggressive species could survive there. What they hadn't understood was what that classification really meant in practical terms. Earth hadn't just produced tough survivors. It had created a species that had spent millions of years perfecting the art of organized violence. Chang-Min had studied military history since his academy days, and he understood better than most how humanity's evolutionary background had shaped their approach to warfare. While other species had evolved on worlds where cooperation and peaceful coexistence were survival strategies, humans had emerged from a planet where everything was trying to kill them. They had learned to fight not just for territory or resources, but for the simple right to exist. Colonel Sujin was demonstrating this principle in the most direct way possible. Her ground forces had been tasked with clearing burning fleet installations on 3 different worlds, and the results were unlike anything the galaxy had ever witnessed. Sujin's Marines didn't just attack enemy positions. They systematically dismantled them with a creativity that left even experienced military observers unsettled. "Colonel, we've secured the primary facility on Kepler 438b, came the report through the tactical comm system. Enemy resistance has been ... neutralized. Sujin's forces had developed techniques that the burning fleet simply couldn't counter. Where the aliens expected direct frontal assaults, humans used deception and misdirection. Where the enemy anticipated conventional siege tactics, human forces employed psychological warfare that exploited weaknesses the aliens didn't even know they had. The most disturbing aspect, from the galactic perspective, was how naturally these tactics came to human forces. They weren't following textbook strategies or implementing theoretical approaches developed in military academies. Instead, they were drawing on instincts that had been refined through countless generations of survival on humanity's hostile homeworld. Other species that had been monitoring the conflict began to realize that humanity's peaceful diplomatic approach over the past decades hadn't been a sign of weakness, it had been a choice. The same creative intelligence that humans applied to art, science, and exploration could be redirected toward warfare with terrifying efficiency. Changmen coordinated fleet movements with the same methodical precision that human ancestors had once used to hunt megafauna across Ice Age landscapes. Each tactical decision was informed by an understanding of warfare as a natural process rather than a political tool. The burning fleet had terrorized the galaxy for centuries because they understood cruelty, but they had never encountered a species that understood violence as a fundamental aspect of existence. The aliens, who had made suffering into an industrial process, found themselves outmatched by creatures who had learned to fight for survival before they had even developed language. Earth's classification as a death world hadn't just produced tough survivors. It had created the galaxy's most efficient predators. The systematic elimination of burning fleet positions continued across multiple star systems, each victory demonstrating that humanity's capacity for organized violence exceeded anything the galaxy had previously encountered. Captain Jae-hoon watched through the bridge viewport as the final burning fleet vessel exploded in a brilliant flash of light against the backdrop of the Kethval system's dying star. The Eternal Torment, once the flagship of Overlord Vextar's personal fleet, had been reduced to scattered debris in less than 30 seconds. With its destruction, a reign of terror that had lasted 3 centuries across dozens of star systems had finally come to an end. "That's the last of them, Captain," reported his tactical officer, scanning the debris field for any signs of survivors. "Long-range sensors confirm no remaining burning fleet vessels in this sector or any adjacent systems." Jae-sung nodded quietly, feeling none of the satisfaction he had expected from this moment. The systematic elimination of the burning fleet had taken 8 months of relentless pursuit across multiple star systems. His tactical squadron had been responsible for hunting down the final remnants of the alien force, tracking them through the ruins of worlds they had destroyed over the centuries. Standing among the wreckage of the Kethval homeworld, the victory felt hollow. They had avenged the billions of innocents who had died at the hands of these monsters, but they couldn't bring back a single life that had been lost. Dr. Young had arrived in the system 3 days earlier with the largest humanitarian fleet in human history. Her mission was to locate and rescue any survivors who might still be held in burning fleet facilities throughout the region. The work was heartbreaking after months of searching. They had found fewer than 10,000 survivors from what had once been a civilization of billions. But Myung's teams weren't just focused on rescue operations. They had also been tasked with studying and repurposing the alien technology that the burning fleet had used for their horrific purposes. Equipment that had been designed to cause maximum suffering was being converted into medical devices and rehabilitation systems. Facilities that had once been centers of systematic torture were being transformed into hospitals and recovery centers. The irony wasn't lost on anyone involved in the operation. Humanity had demonstrated its capacity for unprecedented violence in destroying the burning fleet, and now they were demonstrating their capacity for unprecedented compassion in caring for the survivors. 3 months later, Ambassador Dong-wook stood before the Galactic Council in the Great Assembly Hall on Centauri Prime. Representatives from over 200 species filled the chamber, all of them trying to understand what humanity's actions meant for the future of galactic civilization. The silence in the chamber was absolute as Dong-wook approached the central podium. For decades, humanity had been seen as a peaceful, cooperative species, interested primarily in exploration and cultural exchange. The systematic destruction of the burning fleet had shattered that perception completely. Honored delegates, Dong-wook began, his voice carrying clearly through the vast chamber. 14 months ago, a weak signal reached our monitoring stations. It seemed innocent enough, just another piece of cosmic background noise that our scientists happened to intercept. He paused, letting the weight of those words settle over the assembly. Every species represented in that chamber had heard the story by now, but hearing it from humanity's chief diplomatic representative gave it a different significance. That signal changed everything. It showed us that the universe contains horrors that no civilized being should have to witness. But it also revealed something about humanity that we had kept hidden, our capacity for both unprecedented compassion and unprecedented violence. The ambassador's words echoed through the chamber as representatives from across the galaxy contemplated their implications. Humanity had revealed its true nature, and the galaxy would never forget.